so-called 15-point peace plan, which includes the end of Iran's support for proxy groups, the end of Iran's nuclear programs, and the opening of the Strait of Hormuz.
Total surrender was the message from Donald Trump today.
Absolutely, and it was a non-starter, predictably, for Iran as well. So Iranian reaction put forth its own very maximalist demands. We have complete sovereignty, or should have complete sovereignty, over the Strait of Hormuz, that we need reparations for this attack. We need absolute ironclad guarantees that no attack will take place and all hostilities should
So
stop.
if we have two maximalist plans and neither side prepared to move towards the other, do some of the worst instincts start to come back to the fore?
Well, the first question then is, will there be talks then? Will there be talks that it was being said it will be held in Islamabad, in Pakistan? It doesn't seem like there is going to be talks if no sides can, even on paper or in theory, meet each other's demands. And then from there on, it follows, if there are going to be no talks, would Trump's 5-day ultimatum for hitting Iran's power plant be coming back into force again? Which then puts us back to where we were 3 days ago, worried that if the U.S. strikes Iran's power plants, Iran also threatened to hit the power plants across the... So we'll be back again to square one.
Siavash Adlan, thank you very much indeed. Well, Iran says it has reopened the Strait of Hormuz to non-hostile commercial shipping vessels from countries not involved in the fight. But any shipping that does want to pass has to first negotiate safe passage. There's been a virtual shutdown of the strait since the first days of the war, but some tankers from China, India and Pakistan have managed to negotiate a way through. One of the big questions a lot of our viewers are asking, of course, is whether oil and gas prices will come back down. I should say there's been a fall today. The cost of a barrel of crude did fall below $100, but prices remain high and the market is extremely volatile. Our business editor, Simon Jack, has been speaking to Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, a company which manages over $14 trillion of assets globally. He said sustained oil prices could yet lead to a global recession.
If there's a cessation of war, and yet Iran remains a threat to trade, a threat to the Straits of Hormuz, then I would argue that we could have years of above $100, closer to $150 oil.
What happens to the global economy if that happens? How do we see it?
We'll have global recession.
Well, let's get a thought on that from our economics editor, Faisal Islam. How do you square, Faisal, the brief respite we've had in oil prices today with the confusion over these negotiations?
Well, they're kind of one of the same things. We've seen wild movements in oil prices over as rumours kind of percolate out, both from the White House and also from the responses from Iran. Today, as you say, oil prices are down a bit. They've been a bit stable. They've been bobbing around that $100 mark. And I think just to sort of reflect back on what Larry Fink of BlackRock said there, there's almost like two states that are being averaged out here, which is a kind of conflict that escalates, which is still entirely possible. And in that world, you do have $150 a barrel oil, and in his view, a recession. Or you have de-escalation, where it kind of the oil price goes down quite substantially. And what you have is splitting the difference at 100. No one really knows where this goes in terms of the underlying defense and geopolitics. But there have been some permanent sorts of damage to things like the gas production in Qatar. And then also this general sense about, what is the new reality we have entered here, where even now, where some tankers have made it through the Straits of Hormuz, they have tended to hug the coast in terms of those maps that we can see of the sea traffic close to Iran, which is very suggestive of the fact they've got either permission or they may have even paid some sort of toll, which for kind of multi-million barrel tankers, works out maybe like $1 per barrel, so not as expensive as $1 million toll might suggest. So is that a new reality now? Has Iran established a precedent of control? Is that what we'll have to deal with? What would it mean to clear and reopen the Straits of Hormuz? Do we even know if the rest of the strait is mined? These are all imponderables that even if peace was reached tomorrow, which it's not going to be, would remain in the air.
There are, of course, countries in Asia that are already rationing fuel. How long do you think it is before Europe faces something similar?
When you have the perfect response in your head, but your fingers just can't keep up. We've all been there. Typing, deleting, retyping. Now I use Whisperflow. I just think out loud and it creates perfect formatted text on any Apple website. Whisperflow understood what I was trying.
Now that's a really important question. Clearly, we have seen the main impact in Europe and the US in terms of the price. We've seen it at the petrol, gasoline pumps. We will see it in terms of domestic energy prices at home in the coming months, depending on arrangements on how those are fixed. But what matters, the biggest physical impact is the physical supply. And for example, countries like Pakistan are 99% dependent on exports of liquefied natural gas from Qatar. They're obviously locked in now. There are long-term concerns about the production there. And so yeah, I think you only have to go to the likes of the CEO of Shell, Wael Sawan, who told a conference in the last few hours that yes, that the physical supply of actual molecules rather than the price, it is affecting Asia right now. You're seeing some consequence of that. But Europe could be affected by next month. So now is the time for governments, if this conflict continues, to try and consider demand management measures, to consider storage, all these sorts of things. So yeah, a message there from the top of the energy industry about this physically affecting supplies, potentially in Europe, if this continues into next month.
Faisal, thank you very much for that. Well, a senior minister in the Israeli government has told the BBC today it's probably unlikely that Iran will agree.
He feels there is more to do to weaken the Iranian regime in order to get the kind of deal that Israel feels would stick. I mean, don't forget it was fighting a war with Iran just 8 months ago and said it started this one because the regime had started rebuilding its missile program, rebuilding its nuclear program. So I think Israel's point of view is that there is still a lot more to do before it can get the kind of deal it wants. But having said that, speaking to the economy minister today, it was also clear there is still very tight coordination with its US ally.
So from what you've said, you know that you're very unlikely to get this deal from Iran.
Unfortunately, I probably agree with you.
Iran seems to be gaining some leverage in this war.
I think it's exactly the opposite. I think the world is recognizing who the bully is, who the threat is.
So if Iran doesn't have any leverage, why did President Trump back away from his ultimatum on the Strait of Hormuz?
Look, President Trump is a good negotiator. He knows how to negotiate. He's a businessman, so is Netanyahu. And give them that leeway to get those objectives. I think that everyone understands that on one hand, they are outreaching to see if the objectives